So you guys get very deep with the actual leadership teams and the teams that you're working with to help them increase their productivity, increase revenue, and those kind of things. So my question for you then is, how does that translate into this Being Coachable podcast? So what is this podcast and what is your goal with it?
Well, what happens for me is I get a lot of the same questions, as I'm sure anybody does in their profession when they've been doing it for over 20 years. You hear the same scenarios over and over. Why do we keep having this problem? Or what occurred on this hiring situation? Or why can't I get these two team members to work together? So I thought it would be really helpful to have a podcast where I cover some of these issues that are very common issues that arise for executive teams, for executives themselves, for leaders in organizations, where they could just click on a podcast episode and learn all about that thing. Doesn't mean they won't necessarily need further help, but at least they can get some background knowledge, some key information about what they need to resolve that problem based on my 20 plus years of experience, and they can get it in a quick podcast episode. So that was my thought in creating this podcast.
This is the Being Coachable Podcast with your host, Jill Chiappe. Get ready to challenge your assumptions, expand your thinking, and walk away with concrete steps to help you level up your leadership, business acumen, and personal growth. It's time to get coachable.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. My name is Richard Matthews. I'm here coasting with Jill Chiappe today. Are you there, Jill?
Yes.
Awesome. Glad to have you here. I know this is the introduction episode to the Being Coachable podcast. And so what I wanted to do with you is just very briefly go over who you are and who your clients are. So tell me a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So my name is Jill Chiappe, and I've been an executive coach and leadership development consultant for the last 24 years. And my clients are mostly technology companies, although there's some exceptions to that, but larger companies around the 500 million to a billion range in size. And I work with their executive teams and their executives to develop their leaders and help their C-suites to be better executives and to function better in terms of their teamwork.
Awesome. So what is it that you actually do with the clients? Like, what does a working relationship normally look like?
So it usually starts with some kind of an assessment. I get a referral sometimes from a board member, sometimes from another executive, or an executive calls me because they heard about me by word of mouth. And we talk about what the problem is. So problem could be executives who aren't getting along with each other, an executive who's not performing well, or who is performing well, but is creating problems for other executives, as an example. And the person calls me, and so we do an initial assessment. So we find out what the problem is. Sometimes that's with feedback. It could be a 360 for feedback. A 360 is where we gather feedback all the way around the person. That's why it's called a 360. And so we get that feedback, we find out what the problem is, and then coach the person. That's one option. If it's a team session, sometimes what we do is we just locate what the problem is or the issue is or the pain point is, and then we create a custom training program for that issue. For example, I had one particular technology leader who was a CTO, so a chief technology officer, great person, wonderful with teams, but had never really managed senior leaders before. So great technologist, really understood the product, but needed some help on how to manage particular senior level personalities. So we did an assessment on that, figured out what the feedback was, and then created a program for that person and that person's team to increase the ability of that person to work as a team member, as a manager of the team, and as a leader and executive.
That's cool. So you guys get very deep with the actual leadership teams and the teams that you're working with to help them increase their productivity, increase revenue, and those kind of things.
Yeah, in many cases, I've worked with my client companies for 5, 6, and in some cases, 10 years. So I have one particular client right now that I've worked with for over a decade.
Awesome. So my question for you then is, how does that translate into this Being Coachable podcast? So what is this podcast and what is your goal with it?
Well, what happens for me is I get a lot of the same questions, as I'm sure anybody does in their profession when they've been doing it for over 20 years. You hear the same scenarios over and over. Why do we keep having this problem? Or what occurred on this hiring situation? Or why can't I get these two team members to work together? So I thought it would be really helpful to have a podcast where I cover some of these issues that are very common issues that arise for executive teams, for executives themselves, for leaders in organizations, where they could just click on a podcast episode and learn all about that thing. Doesn't mean they won't necessarily need further help, but at least they can get some background knowledge, some key information about what they need to resolve that problem based on my 20 plus years of experience, and they can get it in a quick podcast episode. So that was my thought in creating this podcast.
So really what you're creating then is you're creating a community resource for these executive teams of large companies that will help them know what the problems are and know what the solutions look like and know what the next steps would be for them if they want to actually solve those problems. Is that about right?
That's almost all of it. I'd say there's one additional piece, which is I find that sometimes people get false information. They've been given this great advice by somebody when they were, doing their MBA or whatever it is. You're always supposed to do XYZ with your teams, always criticize people because it makes them better or whatever. They get some bad idea that's been passed on to them by somebody who is a mentor, a friend, professor, whatever it may be. And it's just simply not working for them. And they don't spot it. They don't realize that it's incorrect information. So because I've been doing this for 24 years and I know what works, I try to pass on those things that actually work and to debunk any myths or false information that people have had about how to run a team or lead a company.
Cool. I'm actually really personally looking forward to your podcast because we're in the same growth stage of growing our company, and we're not quite to the size target that you guys work with, but I'm fairly certain we're going to learn a lot from it with the way that it's going and what you guys are going to be talking about.
Are you hitting a wall as a leader? Do you need an outside perspective to gain clarity and direction? Jill Chiappe has over 20 years of experience as an executive coach, helping leaders get unstuck and achieve their goals. She offers straight talk combined with empathy and humor to challenge your assumptions, expand your thinking, reveal your blind spots, and equip you with concrete action steps. If you're ready to level up your leadership and get coachable, click on Leadership Assessment at becoachable.com and then email to schedule your readout. Cost is $99 to get your results. Invest in yourself and your growth. You'll walk away feeling informed, empowered, and ready to implement change. Let's get coachable.
So what I want to find out next is how often can your listeners expect for you to release new content?
Once a week. So we'll be doing 52 episodes this year, not quite the calendar year, but coming up starting in February.
Cool. And I know that you guys will be doing both audio and video, so they'll be able to find you on YouTube and the podcast networks and other service places like that. But our recommendation is generally for you to follow on your website. So what's the website that they can go and get all of your podcast stuff?
Sure. It's becoachable.com/podcast. So becoachable.com and then podcast.
Good. And now I know on that podcast page, once it's up and ready to go, you'll have access to your YouTube channel, access to the podcast, Apple Podcasts, and access to all the other places that are there. And I know that the links will be there. So that's the primary place people can go and find your podcast as it gets going. And so what I want to do, if you're listening to this is just the introduction episode to the podcast. All the good stuff is going to start happening in episode 1, which is where the next episode will be over there. So make sure that you subscribe and follow Jill. Follow the podcast. And thank you so much, Jill, for putting this resource together for your community. I know our team's really looking forward to this coming out, and I look forward to seeing what you're doing there. Do you have any sort of final thoughts for people who might be getting ready to subscribe or listen to this episode on the podcast before we kick them off over to episode 1?
Thank you, Richard. I'm excited also because I'm really looking forward to having some of the guests that I have upcoming for you as well. I've got some really interesting people whose names you might not know, a couple whose names you might know, but some of the people you might not know who are specialists at particular problems that executive teams have and are going to come on my podcast and talk about those. So I hope to be a great resource for people, and I'm really looking forward to engaging in the conversation in this community.
So thank you so much for putting this together.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Being Coachable podcast. I hope you found value in today's conversation. If you have any follow-up questions or want to continue the discussion, visit our website at becoachable.com and click on Contact. Join our mailing list to receive offers for reduced cost leadership assessments and team building sessions. You can also find show notes, past episode transcripts, and more resources on the podcast tab. I'll catch you on the next episode as we continue to maximize our potential and get coachable.